rival leaders of sub-clans, Mohammed Farah Aidid and Ali Mahdi Mohammed, were going to become rival warlords, which is what the foreign press started to call them. In fact, I knew Ali Mahdi somewhat before the war as a successful businessman who built a nice hotel where I had dinner a couple of evenings. Now, the two rival leaders had all the resources to fight. Their weapons are cheap, of course, and AK-47s and rocket launchers could be had for not very much money. And they also had all the human resources they needed. They had lots of unemployed young men. I remember very well my first day in Mogadishu in November 1984. I went for a walk, and everywhere it seems are these open-air tea houses full of young men who were sitting and talking and drinking occasional tea. And I thought to myself at the time, these idlers amounted to a recipe for possible trouble. I never thought of the possibility of civil war. What I thought was that they were going to be turning to thievery and robbery. Maybe they had already, I don't know. But as it was, they became the so-called technicals, the young men you would see on television standing on the back of trucks and shooting machine guns and rocket launchers into the city of Mogadishu. Now, this gets me to what to me is a basic fact, and that is, not only was Somalia one of the poorest countries in the world, and it still is, it was badly overpopulated even a quarter of a century ago as regarded both human beings and also raising animals. A botanist whom I first met in 1985, who had been coming to Somalia for 25 years, had been recording every year the losses in vegetation and topsoil in the country, and they were appalling. And in that same year, that same period, 25 years, many people had moved from the countryside into the city, and so Mogadishu, which had maybe 75,000 people when the place became independent, 25 years later had a population of at least 1 million, and most of them were underemployed or unemployed. Now, I haven't forgotten to tell you what lessons we can learn from Somalia. And one lesson I'd insist is that a combination of overpopulation and underemployment it's not necessarily, but it can be a source of major trouble. And I'm sorry to say that the population in Somalia continues to boom today in spite of the country's inability to employ or even feed its people. If you look at the CIA World Fact Book online, which I think is probably reliable as any source in things like world population, well, you will see that the estimated fertility rate for Somali women today is 6.35. In other words, the analysts believe that in spite of all the strife that goes on in Somalia, today's average Somali woman is going to bear 6 children in her lifetime. Many of these poor children are going to die in infancy or childhood, but many will not, and the population continues to boom, and the countryside continues to be denuded of vegetation, both by grazing animals and by people who understandably need to have at least a little bit of charcoal for their cooking. Another lesson, I think, is that leadership can make a major difference in whether a state fails or not. We've long been told that the power tends to corrupt, and it's also true. Older people, including leaders, but not only leaders, tend to make more mistakes. In the case of Somalia, Mohammed Siad Barre got old and more corrupt, and he simply didn't understand that he was losing his ability to lead his country, for good or bad. He was losing his ability to lead. And he certainly didn't care what overpopulation was doing to Somalia. I asked him about that once, kind of gingerly. I had no instructions from Washington to raise the subject. And he said very briefly, "You don't understand. I need more young men for the army." Now, some historians of conflict will argue that one or another war was inevitable. Many historians of the American Civil War will say that our Civil War was inevitable. And I've often read that recent conflicts in the Balkans were inevitable. And I don't believe that. I think that in America, before 1860, we had better presidents. We had presidents like Abraham Lincoln, who became president only in '61. If we had had people like Lincoln instead of Millard Fillmore and Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, I do think the war might have been averted. And frankly, I think if Croatia and Serbia had had better leaders, wiser leaders than Franjo Tuđman or Slobodan Milošević, I do think the war might have been averted here too. Speaking of inevitability, I visited Belgrade and Zagreb in 1980. It was not long after Tito had died. And many people outside the Balkans were saying that without Tito, Yugoslavia would inevitably break up and break up soon, and that it would become a failed state. But I remember I returned to Washington thinking that for good or bad, Yugoslavia was probably not going to break up, and indeed it did not break up, at least for some years. I've not been back in Somalia since the Civil War began, and I don't want to tell you too many second-hand stories about that country. But I will remind you that the big international effort in Somalia, peacemaking as much as peacekeeping, was a terrible failure, and it stands in some contrast to the international efforts that have been made here in the Balkans in recent years. And one of the main reasons for the failure of the international effort in Somalia was a lack of leadership. There was simply nobody after Mohammed Siad Barre who could gain the support of all the clan families and become a true national leader. And they have had no such leader until today. And wise leadership was also lacking on the international side as regarded America. The first President Bush was increasingly drawn into Somalia because he feared that the opposition, the Democratic Party, was going to criticize him if he didn't act. Well, that, I think, is not really a good reason for action. And when President Clinton took over and took office in 1993, he and his associates believed that in the future, the United Nations would have to go on from traditional peacekeeping operations in which the peacekeeping force usually lacked a strong mandate from the Security Council, that the world would need to go on to peacekeeping by an international force that did have a strong mandate for action. What Clinton and his people wanted to see was a United Nations organization that could make peace between two warring sides, even when the two sides did not want to see international interference in their conflict. And Somalia was maybe the first prime test case. And after the Civil War started there in 1990, an increasingly large UN force was sent into Somalia. Before it was over, this force amounted to 38,000 soldiers, 2/3 of them Americans. In 1993, the top UN administrator in Somalia, the former American admiral named Jonathan Howe, decided, not very wisely, that one of the two so-called warlords, Aidid, was a war criminal, and he offered $25,000 for Aidid's capture. Well, Aidid at that point announced that he would offer $25,000 for Howe's capture. And in any case, the admiral's action alienated a large number of Somalis, not all only of Aidid's clan. And then, to make things worse, American helicopter gunships fired down into a building in Mogadishu, thinking that they were going to kill Aidid. Instead, they killed a lot of men and women and children and clan elders. And after that, it seemed that most people in Mogadishu, whatever clan, turned against the foreigners. 24 members of the Pakistan contingent were killed, and then 19 American soldiers were killed on the streets of Mogadishu. And then President Clinton abandoned the idea of peacemaking, and pretty soon the international force pulled out. It's true that the alternative would have been at that point to send a much larger force, maybe 200,000 men, into Somalia if the UN was to dominate the country and dictate peace, but that simply was not feasible politically either for the United States, or indeed, I think, for any United Nations member state at the time. I'm not sure how many lessons we can take from the failure of the international effort in Somalia, but perhaps one lesson is that international efforts to help a country, a state that is failing, must depend on the cooperation and the involvement of the local people. And even before the Somali Civil War, there were too many developmental aid projects in Somalia, quite aside from peacekeeping. Too many aid projects in Somalia that were simply not designed to work well in Somali society. And they were not going to keep functioning, and they did not keep functioning once the foreign managers moved out. I think the international community has learned a lot about things like that since then. Now, before I stop talking about Somalia, I should note that there is a relatively peaceful part of Somalia in the northwest that broke off from the rest of the country after the Civil War began and became the Somaliland Republic. It's quite large. It's about a dozen times as large as Kosovo, and it's also quite poor. But it has a fairly sizable export trade and sends animals to the Arabian Peninsula. And last year in the Somaliland Republic, there was a presidential election in which the opposition candidate replaced the incumbent without a civil war resulting. One reason for the relative peace is that all of the Somaliland Republic's inhabitants belong to the same family of clans, the Isaf. But another reason is leadership. The country started off with a good and respected leader, a man whom I had the honor to know, named Mohammed Ibrahim Egal. And Egalberry set up a good police force. He disarmed what rebel groups there were. He provided a certain amount of stability that's still lacking today in and around Mogadishu, which is only 500 kilometers away. Now, the Republic of Kosovo, if I'm not wrong, has been so far recognized by 76 other governments. The Somaliland Republic so far has been recognized by none, but it exists, and in a limited way it progresses. I think that's enough to say about Somalia. Of course, it's not the only failed state. One failed state in the Western Hemisphere, I think failed by any definition, is the Republic of Haiti. It's not difficult, I think, to see what went wrong in Haiti. And that started 2 centuries ago, more than that, when the Haitians rose up and took the country back from their French masters. Well, it was a fully justifiable revolution, but it didn't solve the problem of Haiti's future. It had been the richest colony in the world, and it went steadily downhill. And the elite, a group of mixed blood people with relatively good educations to go with the country. Well, slavery was gone, but the mass of peasants remained uneducated, and even today only about half of Haitians can read and write. And besides that, when the French owned plantations that operated for the slaves, when they ceased to operate by the slaves, the peasants now went back simply to raising small gardens as their ancestors had done in Africa. And so Haiti's profitable export trade in sugar simply stopped, and the elite who controlled the country, controlled the government, never devised anything that could replace it. I think perhaps the main lesson from Haiti is that it is at best difficult to raise a poor peasant society to a higher economic level. And it's not a question of blacks and whites. One of the main problems in Russian society, I think, starting long before 1917, has certainly been how to bring the Russian peasantry into the modern world. And if it's not done in Haiti or in Russia or elsewhere, why, I think the possibility of national progress becomes difficult at best. I think it's tempting for me in this brief talk, and I am getting toward the end of it, to generalize, and maybe too much, but if we look at other failed states, notably in Africa, why we do see some common factors behind their failures. For one thing, they were in general oppressed by foreign imperialists, by other powers, who left most of them still illiterate after fixing boundaries for them that remain today, even though too often they are wrong and unjust, both economically and ethnically. And in addition to what Europeans did or didn't do, why I think there have been too many cases both in Africa and elsewhere of one ethnic group dominating another and in the process impeding economic and social progress. I think, for example, of the Amhara in Ethiopia, or the Tutsi in Central Africa, or the Japanese in Indonesia. But certainly the Europeans deserve a lot of blame. It wasn't the Amhara in Addis Ababa, but a British ambassador in Rome who drew the boundary between Ethiopia and Somalia that left far too many Somalis on the Ethiopian on the other side of the border. And if Indonesia has problems with minorities today, and certainly it does, it was not the Japanese, it was the Dutch who put the country together centuries ago. And I think we'll all agree that the educational system is a key factor in the development of any country. It's not just a question of teaching people to read or write, or the problem of educating a cadre, and I don't mind calling it an elite, that can lead a society forward and not simply promote its own interests, as happened, for example, in Haiti. Historians of Latin America used to comment, and perhaps they still do, that while there are numbers, great numbers of university graduates in Latin American countries, even decades ago, why too many of them studied law. And since they couldn't all succeed as lawyers in Nicaragua or Ecuador, why they went instead into politics, and they tended to start revolutions, which were quite useless. Now, of course, a country needs lawyers, but it also needs agronomists and artisans and economists. You understand what I'm saying? And you forgive me if I sound simplistic, but in my own country, in recent years, people will tell me that too many of the best and brightest young Americans have gone into banking and finance to make their fortunes, and not enough of them, not enough of us, into engineering or manufacturing or research or teaching. And that's, frankly, that's not a good augury for the future. Now, before I end my remarks and take your questions, I think it might be useful to look at a country which is at the opposite end of the list of failed states, and that is Norway, which is supposed to be the most successful country in the world.